Welcome to State of Play. I'm Will Todman, Chief of Staff of the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In this podcast, we bring together our leading experts to unpack the latest geopolitical developments from around the world and what it all means. On Monday, President Trump announced a 20-point plan to end the war in Gaza after meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in the White House. And at the time of recording, Hamas has not yet delivered its response. This comes after nearly 2 years of war. Hamas's attacks on October the 7th and Israel's response have not only remade the face of the Middle East, but they're having global ramifications. In those initial attacks, Hamas killed more than 1,200 people in Israel, and Israel's retaliation has killed at least 66,000 Palestinians, according to Gaza health officials, and it's destroyed much of the Gaza Strip. But the UN Security Council has been unable to end the war amid gridlock, and the US has cast 6 vetoes relating to Israel and Gaza since October the 7th, and that's under both the Biden and the Trump administrations. And Israel's international isolation has grown. The International Criminal Court, the ICC, has issued an arrest warrant for Netanyahu. Some of Israel's closest allies, including Canada, France, and the UK, have recognized Palestinian statehood during the recent UNGA meeting in New York. And these decisions have driven wedges in key international institutions like the G7. Supporters of Israel have also dismissed findings by various international institutions, saying they're biased or anti-Semitic. The IPC confirmed famine in Gaza in August, and shortly after, the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry concluded that Israel has committed genocide in Gaza. And in response, the US ambassador to Israel said, the UN, and I quote, should declare itself corrupt and incompetent. The US government has also cut funding for key international bodies. So the questions then for today: has the war in Gaza prompted an irreversible break in the effectiveness of international institutions? Or are we instead seeing the birth of a new global system in which countries from the global south are asserting their agency more loudly and calls to reform global institutions are growing? So, is Gaza pushing international institutions to crisis or to renewal? And I am joined today by Mona Yacoubian and Caitlin Welsh. Caitlin Welsh is the director of the Global Food and Water Security Program and our first guest from CSIS's new Global Development Department. Welcome, Caitlin.
Thank you, Will.
You came to CSIS in 2020 from the National Security Council and the National Economic Council, where you coordinated US policy in the G7 and G20 across multiple summits during the first Trump administration. And I also understand you were just in New York for UNGA.
I was.
How was that?
Still recovering.
Okay. Oh, I'm excited to hear more about what you learned there. And Mona Yacoubian, welcome back. Mona is Senior Advisor and Director of the Middle East Program, my boss. Mona, last time you were on, it was your birthday, and I made you talk about war in Iran. So I just wanted to check today's not your anniversary or something like that.
No, I wish I had some kind of wonderful milestone to share with you.
Okay.
But I do not, unfortunately, today, Will. Sorry to disappoint.
Okay. Well, I should say before we start this that we normally try to keep State of Play quite lighthearted, but this is really not a lighthearted topic at all, so it's going to sound a bit different. And on that note, I want to start by exploring the extent to which the Gaza war represents a crisis for international institutions. I mentioned gridlock in the UN Security Council. Is it fair to say that this war has proven, once and for all, that the UN Security Council is no longer fit for purpose?
You never want to say once and for all that's it. But I think if we think about just how significant the conflict in Gaza has been, the level of suffering, and as you note, 6 U.S. vetoes in the UN Security Council since the start. I mean, in some ways, without sounding flip, it is almost like a poster child for the ineffectiveness of the UN to address key threats to peace and security. I think if we think about it, it's been less than 2 years. We've seen this horrific conflict on the ground in Gaza, but we've also seen it reverberate out into the Middle East, into the region. We have 4 or 5 flashpoints: Lebanon, Syria, Iran, Yemen, and the Red Sea. All of this going on, and the international community seemingly incapable of stopping it, of finding even, a long-standing ceasefire.
And maybe, one of the most surprising reverberations of this was when Israel struck Qatar, struck Doha just a couple of weeks ago, a major, a U.S. major non-NATO ally.
The fact that I didn't even list that in my list, I'm not sure what we should take from that, except that it was astounding that happened. And I think it really does underscore just how significant this conflict has been in terms of the ways in which it has exposed the Middle East as feeling like a region without guardrails.
And I want to talk a bit more about those guardrails, because that's partly what international institutions are meant to be serving as, and sort of, guiding the behavior of the states. But we've seen really important diplomatic cleavages emerge within the G7 as well. I mentioned that 3 members of the G7 recognized Palestinian statehood over the opposition of the US to that. So is the G7, is this now also an institution that is struggling with the aftermath of the Gaza conflict?
I wouldn't say that only now is the G7 struggling. I think this is something that we've seen for the past several years, at least for the past 5 years, I would say. As you noted, the number of G7 countries that have recognized the Palestinian state has increased even over the past couple of weeks. It's now the UK, France, Canada.
Yeah. And Japan has said it's a matter of not if, but when.
Okay. And what I'll do now is borrow a phrase from one of our colleagues, the director of CSIS's Europe program, Max Bergman, who said on the eve of the last G7 summit, of the 2025 G7 summit, that the question is not, will this be an awkward family gathering, but rather, is this still a family?
Mm-hmm. And Caitlin, I wanted to ask you about another manifestation of this, because obviously you spend a lot of time focusing on food security at CSIS. And we saw the IPC declare famine in August. And then the reaction to it was really, quite strong opposition from Israel and other supporters of Israel. So do you see this as part of a trend of kind of growing distrust in institutions? And also, while we have you, can you explain some of those accusations about the IPC report in particular, and kind of the extent to which it has been discredited?
Sure. So at first, I'll take a high-level view to say that I'm seeing distrust in institutions coinciding with falling funding for these institutions, and both these things combining for the result of simply weakening of the institutions themselves across the board, many types of different institutions. So that's a high-level response, but I will do, as you said, Will, just a quick sidebar to talk about how it is that famine is determined globally. And it was going on actually a little bit over 20 years ago that a number of countries and a number of organizations around the world decided to formalize and standardize the measurement of acute food insecurity around the world, so that you could have standard measurements of acute food insecurity across different times and different places. And so that's when the IPC was born in 2004. And the way that the IPC determines that famine exists is by looking at 3 criteria. Those criteria have to do with, number 1, lack of food, so acute food insecurity in households. Number 2, deaths per day due to starvation. And number 3 is acute malnutrition among children. And the IPC has done assessments of Gaza since October 7th. I believe the first assessment was in December of 2023. So the IPC has done a number of assessments, and the IPC has convened what's called the Famine Review Committee, which is a group of experts in health and food security and mortality that actually are the experts that determine if famine is happening or not. When the IPC issued its determination of famine in August of this year. It stated that never before has the Famine Review Committee been called so many times to assess famine in the same place. So that in and of itself was historic. The IPC, up until August, had warned of famine, but finally in August did determine that famine was existing in one directorate in one governorate in Gaza, but predicting that would spread to 3 governorates in Gaza. So now to your question about controversy over the determination. And there was immediate controversy because you had public statements issued by the Israel Foreign Ministry, by COGAT, and that were echoed by others.
Can you explain what COGAT is?
It is by the Israel Foreign Ministry, by the Coordination of Government Affairs in the Territories, or COGAT, and echoed by others. And just some examples. So the statement by COGAT that was put out on Twitter or on X said that the IPC's finding was riddled with severe methodological flaws, and it encouraged the international community not to be swept away by false narratives and unfounded propaganda. We're seeing things like that. And there's one point that you see put out by the Israeli government and by others, and it's about the measurement of acute malnutrition among children.
That was the third of the criteria.
The third criteria. Okay. And I want to say that the IPC says that there are 2 ways to measure acute malnutrition. And again, thank you for letting me sidebar on this really quickly, but I think it's very, very important. 2 ways. The first way is to take a ratio of weight to height among children. The second way is to take a measurement of mid-upper arm circumference. Those are 2 different dimensions of nutrition or malnutrition among children, and so they have 2 different thresholds. If you use the weight and height measurement, then 30% or more of children must be found to be malnourished to meet that criteria. If you use the other one, the mid-upper arm circumference, or MUAC, then 15%.
Okay.
So in this instance, in Gaza, because scales and measuring boards are reportedly not allowed in Gaza, because there are not enough staff to be doing those measurements, because there can't be consistent measurement of those things for a lot of reasons. They couldn't use weight for height, so had to use MUAC. And so found that according to that measurement, the malnutrition threshold was met. Now that was, again, very consistent with IPC methodology, but interpreted by others, including the Israeli government, as a lowering of the threshold. It wasn't a lowering of the threshold. It was simply using a different way to measure acute malnutrition. Very, very important to note that this is the same way that acute malnutrition in children was measured when famine was determined in Sudan in 2024, in South Sudan in 2017, and there were no complaints. There were no cries at about corruption or such when those determinations were made.
I just wanted to jump in and ask that, because it is striking, this kind of controversy around what presumably are fairly empirical, data-driven measures of a situation on the ground. And have we ever seen this level of controversy around something like a famine determination that does have these very, as you've just laid down in great detail, these very clearly prescribed measures. And yet here we are with questions about it, and photos were doctored. I mean, there were all kinds of allegations being made around something as important, as significant, but presumably as empirically determined as whether or not there's famine.
I'll answer that in a couple of different ways, Mona. That's a very important question. One is through my conversation with some people that were involved in the determination of famine in Gaza, saying that they have never experienced such pushback against what is a very factual, very data-driven analysis. Second way that I'll answer this is just by pointing to something that was published by a refugee organization that's led by a former U.S. official that calls what Israel is doing active disinformation. And so I think that it's not just questioning of methodology for question's sake, but rather a desire to promote mis or disinformation.
And that's become such a big part of this conflict, the sort of fight over the facts and the different truths that have emerged and are being put forward by different sides. This also does seem as well, though, that we're seeing a kind of breakdown in some of the global efforts, things like the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And Caitlin, you were just at UNGA, I should say as well, the UN General Assembly. So my accent makes that confusing. So
doesn't everybody know what UNGA is?
Yeah.
Well, New Yorkers call it UNGA. They say, traffic is so bad when UNGA happens.
Okay. So apart from the fact that the traffic was very bad. What were those conversations like in the UN? And when we were chatting before, I think you mentioned it's not your first UNGA that you've gone to, and maybe quite a different environment now.
Yeah. Full disclosure that I was at UNGA to work on other issues that maybe we can talk about in other episodes of State of Play.
I would love that. Yeah.
But I will note that it occurred to me that the atmosphere at UNGA has changed very drastically in a very short period. So having served in the U.S. government at a couple different places for 12 years or so, it was not my first UNGA. I was at UNGA in 2015 when all member states of the UN adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, launching the Sustainable Development Goals, which was right around the time that the Paris Agreement was announced. I believe that was later. That was after UNGA in 2015. So that was 2015. Fast forward to 2025, and what you have in 2025 is a U.S. government that has renounced the SDGs, saying that the SDGs are inconsistent with U.S. sovereignty and adverse to the rights and interests of Americans, and that globalist endeavors like the Agenda 2030 and SDGs lost at the ballot box in 2025, in 2024 rather. So it's remarkable to me how the U.S. government's position has how the pendulum has swung drastically in a short time. I also want to remark that both of these endeavors, the Agenda 2030 and also the Paris Agreement, are entirely voluntary. There's nothing that's binding about either agreement. Now, I understand, and this is not anything new with this Trump administration versus the last Trump administration, but the administration takes issue with certain aspects of the SDGs, certain climate or gender-related goals. Again, this is entirely voluntary. There's nothing binding at all. And most of the rest of the SDGs are very, I would say, even banal, things that, most people would want to agree to, like quality education and clean water and reducing poverty.
Yeah. And I do want us to talk about the humanitarian piece of this as well, because the three of us were just in a meeting where we heard from some people who had just some humanitarian workers who'd just come back from Gaza. And international humanitarian law came up. But I think there were some really striking comments about the erosion of humanitarian norms. Mona, kind of what struck you?
It was both moving and chilling to hear the descriptions of actors from various humanitarian organizations on the ground, and quite frankly, the desperation and emotion in their voices of what civilians in Gaza face, the hardships, but also those humanitarian workers seeking to provide assistance. And the idea that there is no longer humanitarian space in Gaza, that all norms of international humanitarian law have been transgressed. That is really frightening when you step back and think about the implications of that. And there were all kinds of factoids and things shared about just the inability, the lack of access to food and nutrition, the level of acute malnutrition, the fact that babies are now being born malnourished because their mothers themselves are malnourished. And for me, it was striking, having worked on a number of conflicts from the Middle East, whether it's Syria or in Lebanon or Yemen or elsewhere, and this sort of steady erosion of humanitarian access and norms that are considered sort of part and parcel of international law as part of the establishment of the UN really does raise, I think, bigger questions about what does all of this mean? And at what point does the international community stand up and say, where are we going from here?
So I want to then pivot to that point and maybe insert a bit of optimism, or at least if you can help walk us through what this looks like going forward. And as I said at the start, one of the questions that I want to tackle is, could this be a moment of renewal for international institutions? And are we seeing some, seeds potentially of more efficient or more effective international institutions or that can maybe gain greater buy-in from the Global South? The Global South has been a big part of pushing some of these, the cases I mentioned before. So I wonder if you think it's too much to say that we're seeing a shift in the global balance of power away from this Western-led order and international institutions that it has built towards a growing power and influence of the global South in shaping the conversation. Is that an exaggeration? Is that too much to say, or?
I don't think that's an exaggeration. I think we've seen Gaza really almost as a wedge issue or a leading issue that has been, that has been sort of, I don't know what the word is. It's heralded, trumpeted. I don't know what the word is, but that the global South has really sort of latched onto as showing the sort of, unwillingness of key stakeholders in the international order, with, I guess, the U.S. at the head of the list, the unwillingness to enforce these norms and therefore demanding more and demanding better. And so what that looks like, though, I think is an open question. I'm not sure that this is that watershed. I wish it were, but I'm not entirely convinced that we're going to see the kinds of effective reforms and a renewed respect for international law as a result of what we've witnessed in Gaza. I think the jury's very much out on that still.
I'll take your question in a little bit different way, if that's okay. Just from the perspective of institutions and U.S. support for institutions. Under the first Trump administration, there was strong critique of many international institutions. WTO is as one glaring example.
The World Trade Organization.
Yes, World Trade Organization. Thank you. And at the same time, those who were dealing with the WTO who had again strong critiques, a lot of problems with it, would say that if the WTO didn't exist, we would need to build it. We would still need it. Even though we have problems with it, with WTO as it exists today, we know that there's a need for it. And now one question that I have is whether or not this administration agrees to the need for many of the international institutions that we're talking about. It may have problems with the IPC, for example, but does it still agree that there is a need for a partnership that standardizes assessments of hunger, acute hunger around the world, so that the world can respond appropriately? Or does it not agree to that? Now, if the administration agrees that we need these institutions, then maybe that's an entry point for reform. But if the U.S. government no longer agrees to the necessity of these organizations, then to put a positive spin on this, then perhaps that could also ultimately create an opening for rebuilding institutions in better ways, because the world has changed since, I'm just thinking of the IPC.
Yep.
Uniquely, since we've been talking about it so much today. But the world has changed, politics have changed, alliances have changed, technology has changed, the nature of food security has changed. Much has changed in 2004. So there are probably a lot of ways to do it, or at least some strong ways that we can do things better were we to need to rebuild that partnership.
Could I jump in on this? Because there's one other thought that occurred to me, Caitlin, as you were speaking, which is if we think about the global South, if we think about rising middle powers, and if we think about kind of the sort of erosion of some of these UN-funded organizations, we are seeing Gulf states step up and play a different role here. We're seeing them step up and provide more assistance. Will, you and I are going to be leading an interesting discussion on the changing global aid landscape at the Doha Forum coming up in December. I think it's going to be really interesting to watch and see what kind of role do these kind of rising powers from the global South play in shaping the future of aid and kind of these institutions going forward.
Absolutely. Okay. You know that I want to talk a lot more about that, but we will save that for now.
So I just had to get the plug in.
Yes. So let's go for the rapid round then of questions, as we always do at the end. So the first one, in one word, can you sum up the state of international institutions?
Eroding,
yeah.
One letter, 2 words.
Okay.
Atrophied for the reasons we talked about.
Yeah.
Distrust and lack of funding, and also alert. And I'm drawing from my conversations around UNGA, those representatives from those organizations that we're talking about that are still receiving some funding are very alert to any signal from the U.S. government or other governments about increases or decreases in funding. They're alert to, increase efficiencies so they can make the best use of funding that they have, et cetera.
Okay. Interesting. Thank you. So then the next one, so out of the US, China, and Russia, who would you say is up and who is down the most this week? That can be relating to UNGA or more broadly, as you choose to define it.
I'll take this one
first.
I'll see if you agree or disagree.
Go. Yeah.
But I focused more on Ukraine than on other things. But among those 3 that you presented, I would say the United States, if this 20-point peace plan, which at the time of recording, we don't know if Hamas has agreed to or not, leads to peace and ultimately allows a full-scale humanitarian response in Gaza in the long term, then I would say that last week, UNGA, which is diplomatic speed dating or diplomacy on steroids, would have proven a great use of U.S. diplomatic efforts.
Okay, yeah. And President Trump presented this plan to lots of Arab leaders, Islamic leaders of Islamic countries as well. So, okay, yeah. Mona?
So I have an allergy to up-down questions.
Okay.
Just saying, full
That's another A
disclosure.
word, though.
Full disclosure here. I sort of agree with you, Caitlin, on this point. I mean, I think the jury is so out on this 20-point plan, and I think there are so many questions about what it will look like. And I will also note there was a little bit of a bait and switch in terms of what was presented on the sidelines of UNGA by the administration to Arab and Muslim leaders, and then what was actually signed off on.
Yeah.
And so I think we're gonna need to watch really closely in the coming days to see what happens. I think looking at Russia and China, they kind of had latter speaking slots. I went to check and see, like they didn't speak until Friday or Saturday, and it was just interesting. It's just interesting to see China trying to sort of leverage the UN in a different direction.
Yeah.
And I think that goes back to some of our conversations earlier about Global South and so forth. And so at the end of the day, though, I think, even though it was the 80th anniversary of the UN, it didn't feel particularly celebratory.
Yeah. And I'm going to put in a plug for something you just wrote. So you just wrote a piece looking at the so-called CRINC axis, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and looking at their diplomatic engagement. And part of that looked at voting patterns in the UN as well as meetings. And I think correct me if I'm mischaracterizing this, but part of your findings is it's not so much an axis necessarily in its own right, but it's making appeals to the global South in a really important way, and I think that fits into this conversation that we've been having.
Exactly.
Now.
Thank you for that.
Yes. So okay, finally then, what one word or phrase would you ban pundits from saying in their writing, talking about UNGA, in their analysis?
I'll jump in. Mona has an allergy to up-down questions. I have an allergy to the word resilience or resilient, particularly in the context of development or humanitarian response or diplomacy around those things. First, because I think that term can be misunderstood. And second of all, because I think that those who use it have the intention of expressing, making a pithy statement or something like that. But to me, it's an empty vehicle. When I host conversations, if the word is used, I say, actually, you can't use that word. Tell me what you mean by that.
Okay.
When you say you want to build it, tell me how you're going to do that.
Yeah.
So similar rationale for my word, which is dysfunctional, which
Okay.
we hear all the time. But I think that's a lazy way of sort of underscoring things aren't working. But to your point, tell me what you mean by that. Unpack that further. Dysfunctional, how?
Yeah.
Because if we don't understand the how, we're never going to figure out how to kind of remedy the challenge.
Well, those are two very productive ones. Usually, yes, people are bugbears, but that's great. Okay, Caitlin and Mona, you have described a region without guardrails in the aftermath of those awful attacks of October the 7th and then Israel's response. You've talked about how international institutions have been defunded and discredited, and talked about disinformation as they've been attacked as well, and generally a steady deterioration of international norms, particularly in the humanitarian sphere. So there are lots of reasons, I think, to say that the Gaza war has created a real crisis for international institutions. But then as we shifted, we did talk about how the global South has latched on to Gaza, and it's unclear where that goes. It's unclear how these countries will raise their voices and exert more power on the international stage. But it's certainly going to be interesting to watch what role there is for these rising middle powers going forward and how they do articulate their voices and their power. And then I think, Caitlin, you talked about some of the ways in which this could create an opening for new institutions, ones that keep up with the technological advancements that we've seen since many of these were first envisioned. And, it's not necessarily all doom and gloom. This could be a sort of inflection point for some of these. But ultimately, you described international institutions as eroded, atrophied, but alert. And so I think we'll finish on that point and say, there is a chance that for reform and rebirth or reimagining going forward. So perhaps a little bit of hope to end with. But thank you so much for joining me today. I'm very grateful for your insights and great to have you on the show.
Great. Thank you, Will. Difficult topic, but wonderful to be with both of you.
Indeed. Thank you both so much.
Thanks for listening to State of Play. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to it wherever you heard it. And you can find more analysis at www.csis.org/geopolitics. Until next time.